Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 653, and today is August 9th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of big news to talk about on today's show, but first, need to mention the sponsor of the show, and that is the Expat Money Summit 2024, which is the world's largest offshore event taking place entirely online from October 7th through the 11th, put on Mikkel Thorup, who is the host of the Expat Money Show. Fantastic show, by the way. I was on an episode a few months ago. The very high production quality of that show. I really recommend checking out the episode I was on just to see how much work they put into putting out a very high quality product over at the Expat Money Show. And Mikkel is also a highly sought after expat consultant with over 2 decades of experience. And so during the summit, you can discover why international diversification is a must for those looking to preserve their liberty and wealth, and you can learn everything you need to know about crafting your perfect plan B. This includes acquiring a second passport, diversifying your finances offshore, investing in real estate, and getting in-depth insights on geopolitics from world-renowned experts. Headline speakers include Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horn, and Tom Woods. Of course, I will also be speaking on one of the VIP panels. It's a great panel. Really recommend checking it out. It's myself and then Dave DeCamp, who you all know very well from antiwar.com, and also Hrvoje Morić, who is the Geopolitics and Empire show. And I've done a couple episodes and interviews with him in the past, and I really like Hrvoje as well. So I imagine the panel will be absolutely fantastic. And so head on over to the Expat Money Summit .com. Again, that's the expatmoneysummit.com. And that will allow you to reserve your complimentary ticket to the Expat Money Summit. Again, that's expatmoneysummit.com. All right, everybody, let's get into the show today. Just a quick reminder, you can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee if you want the video version. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And, of course, you can find the show at the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, and by following me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. All right, let's get into the news today, and a pretty shameful article here from the American government. U.S. ambassador boycotts Nagasaki A-bomb ceremony because Israel is not invited. So, U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, will boycott Friday's memorial service in Nagasaki commemorating the 79th anniversary of the U.S. dropping a nuclear bomb on the city because Israel was not invited to the event. Emanuel said the ceremony had become politicized by the decision not to invite Israel, but Russia and Belarus will also be excluded for the third year in a row, a move that is supported by the United States. So envoys from the U.S., UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and the European Union sent a letter to Nagasaki last month saying it would be difficult for us to have high-level participation if Israel wasn't invited. The envoy said the decision would equate Israel with Russia and Belarus. Nagasaki's mayor stuck to his decision not to invite Israel despite the pressure. He said it was due to concerns that Israeli attendance could lead to demonstrations disrupting the ceremony. The mayor explained, "I will continue to preserve and ask for understanding for the decision as often as necessary." He added that the decision was not made for political reasons, but to ensure a smooth ceremony in a peaceful and solemn environment. Israel's ambassador to Japan was invited to Hiroshima ceremony on Tuesday, which was attended by Emmanuel and other Western ambassadors. The ambassadors of the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and the EU are expected to boycott the Nagasaki ceremony along with Emmanuel, and the Western nations will send lower-level representatives instead. Israeli officials have pointed to the U.S. and allied bombings of Japan and Germany during World War II to justify the mass slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. President Biden said Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pointed to the U.S. atomic bombings of Japan, which killed over 200,000 Japanese civilians, in conversations they had about Gaza. So this is a Biden quote from December of 2023. It was pointed out to me by Netanyahu that, well, you carpet bombed Germany, you dropped the atomic bomb, a lot of civilians died. And in one sense, I understand why you would think that maybe this isn't all that important. They did go to one of the atomic bombing ceremonies. They're just not going to the other one. They are sending a lower level representative. But I do think this is important to looking at the overall U.S. policy towards Israel, where we really prioritize this above anything else. And so here you have Japan not inviting Israel, an Israeli official, to attend this one ceremony, and this leads to boycotts from the US, and that's because if we allow Israel's reputation to be tarnished, if we allow Israel to be equated with Russia and Belarus, which what Israel is doing in Gaza is probably significantly worse than what Russia is doing in Ukraine, then it creates this problem of why would we be supporting Ukraine while at the same time we're supporting the Israelis when it's very damaging to the whole U.S. propaganda narrative and to Israelis' reputation if they're not invited to these, large international gatherings and things like that. So I do think this is probably significant that the U.S. isn't attending here, even though it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, and just goes to show how firm the U.S. support is for Israel in all of this, even when it's against the U.S.'s own interest. All right, so we'll return to news on Gaza and the Middle East in a few minutes here, but I want to go over these two rather large stories that broke yesterday and the day before about what's happening in Ukraine. So let's start off here. This one from Dave DeCamp on Wednesday at antiwar.com. Ukraine launches incursion into Russia's Kursk Oblast. So Russia said Wednesday that its forces were fighting off Ukrainian ground incursion into Russia's Kursk Oblast, and attack Russian President Vladimir Putin called a large-scale provocation. So far, Ukrainian officials have been quiet on the cross-border attack, which was launched from Ukraine's Sumy Oblast. According to RT, the Russian military estimates that 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers with dozens of armored vehicles entered the Russian oblast. Drones were also reported, and Kursk's acting governor said one hit an ambulance, killing 2 paramedics. In a meeting with his top officials, Putin said Ukrainian forces attacking Kursk were firing indiscriminately from different types of weapons, including rockets at civilian buildings, residential houses, and ambulance. The Russian Defense Ministry said Wednesday that the fighting was still ongoing and it thwarted a breakthrough. The ministry said 5 residents have been killed in the Ukrainian attack and claimed that it inflicted 260 casualties on the invading Ukrainian forces. Ukraine has supported cross-border attacks into Russia launched by militias, including the neo-Nazi Russian Volunteer Corps, but the fighting in Kerch appears to be its biggest ground attack into Russian territory since the start of the war. Meanwhile, fighting continues across the front lines, and Russian forces are continuing to make gains in Ukraine's Donetsk region. The Kursk attack could be an attempt to stretch Russian lines, but Ukraine has also been struggling with manpower issues and could end up losing more territory as a result. So now let's get a little bit more information on this. Pentagon says it supports Ukraine using U.S. weapons in Russia's Kursk Oblast. This one, Dave DeCamp, Thursday, antiwar.com. The Pentagon said on Thursday that Ukraine is allowed to use U.S. weapons in its offensive in Russia's Kursk Oblast, which began on Tuesday. The Pentagon spokeswoman Sabrina Singh was asked if Ukraine's use of U.S. weapons in Russia was consistent with U.S. policy, which she replied, "It is consistent with our policy." She framed the attack on the Russian region as a defensive operation against Russia attacks from across the border, saying the U.S. has supported Ukraine from the beginning to defend themselves against attacks that are coming across the border. For the first 2 years of the war, the U.S. prohibited Ukraine from striking Russian territory with U.S.-provided missiles, but recently lifted that restriction in the wake of Russia's offensive in Kharkiv. The administration claims it won't support long-range strikes into Russian territory, but it's not clear what the limits are. So Singh added, I'm not going to put a specific region on it when asked about the possibility of U.S. weapons being used for attacks on Moscow. And she said that the use of U.S. weapons in Russia was for crossfire purposes. So, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, U.S. forces have used U.S. provided Bradley fighting vehicles in the attack on Russia. The sanctioned use of U.S. armored vehicles on the ground in Russia marks a significant escalation in the proxy war and risked a major Russian response. Last year, pro-Kiev militias, including the neo-Nazi Russia Volunteer Corps, used U.S. vehicles in raids in Russia's Belgorod Oblast. At the time, the U.S. said it opposed the equipment being used for such attacks. The Russian Defense Ministry said Wednesday that 1,000 Ukrainian fighters with dozens of armored vehicles had entered the region. The ministry said it thwarted any breakthrough, but heavy fighting continued on Thursday. Ukrainian officials haven't directly acknowledged the assault, but Zelensky said Thursday that Russia needed to feel the consequences of the war. Russia brought the war to our land and should feel what it has done. So, a few points to make on this. One, Zelensky isn't completely wrong here. I'll just say that at the beginning. Russia did invade Ukraine, and so Ukraine could carry out attacks inside of Russia. That wouldn't necessarily be morally wrong or unjustified. However, the problem here is that these attacks are being done with U.S. weapon systems. And when the attacks are being done with U.S. weapon systems, this creates a problem because it pushes the U.S. and Russia closer to a major conflict. And there's a strategic problem with all of this as well, because of course this is going to escalate the conflict and Russia's going to step up attacks inside of Ukraine. And this isn't something that's going to really reverse the overall course of the war. It's not going to change what we're going to see, that eventually Russia will prevail in this war of attrition. It's just going to, at most, maybe delay the Russian operations a little bit. So I could see two maybe possible things that the Ukrainian government is thinking here. One is that they're trying to do everything they can to prevent the Russian advances, because the more and the faster the Russians advance, the more likely it is that the Ukrainian front lines completely collapse, and that could ultimately lead to a collapse of the Ukrainian government. And so the idea here is they identified some kind of vulnerability within Russian territory that they didn't see on the front lines in Ukraine, where there's, ample Russian forces to repel any Ukrainian assault. And so rather than carrying out, essentially a military assault on Russian forces, they carried out a raid on a civilian area of Russia. My guess is what the Ukrainians are hoping for is that the Russians will see this and they'll feel the need to commit more forces to the Russian-Ukrainian border, and this may or may not, depending on the Russian force posture and what it's going to take to reallocate forces to different regions of Russia. Maybe this will take away some of either the military equipment or forces that Russia would have otherwise sent to Ukraine, maybe in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kharkiv, something like that. And, they see this as basically reorienting the Russian soldiers away from Ukraine. Maybe that happens. Again, it doesn't really change the long-term outcomes of the war, but maybe it does delay a Russian offensive by a few weeks or something like that. The other possibility here is this is really just intentional cruelty inflicted on the civilians of Russia, with the idea in Kiev that the Russian people need to feel the same pain as the Ukrainian people in order to demand their government stop this war. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there's any real effort among the Russian grassroots to call an end to this war, and so it doesn't seem like we're going to see the conflict end from that way. All right, moving on here. Once again, by the way, everyone, we are still holding our fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. We are getting pretty close to our goal here, and we do still have some matching funds in place. So if you haven't contributed yet, head on over to the Institute and you can make a donation to help us out, keep this show going, and help me to write all these articles that I write, like the one we're going to talk about here. Arab states reject the U.S. plan to send peacekeepers to Gaza. So 3 Arab states approached by the U.S. about sending its soldiers to the Gaza Strip in a peacekeeping role were rejected. 2 Muslim countries expressed interest in participating in the mission that would begin after Israel ends its onslaught. So the Times of Israel reported Jordan, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia refused U.S. requests to send peacekeepers to Gaza. One Arab official said that Jordan, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia view the mission as protecting Israel from the Palestinians. Egypt and the UAE have taken different positions and expressed a willingness to join such a mission. Dubai and Cairo's participation, however, is contingent upon Washington's involvement in any agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The White House has been seeking Arab countries to engage in a post-war peacekeeping force in the besieged enclave. Secretary of State Antony Blinken explained to regional nations that the U.S. will establish and train the peacekeeping force. However, it is unclear if the plan will materialize, as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is actively undermining negotiations and has stated that he will be unwilling to sign any agreement that commits Tel Aviv to a permanent end to the war. Several top Israeli officials have called for the Israeli Defense Forces to ethnically cleanse the Strip. Netanyahu has argued that Israel needs to eliminate Hamas's governing and military capabilities there, although top Israeli and military and intelligence officials say that goal is impossible. Okay, so a few points I want to make here. One, not sure how much this story necessarily matters, because this deal only really works if, one, Israel is willing to agree to a permanent end to the conflict, and that there's Palestinians in Gaza once the conflict ends, and it seems like those two things are rather unlikely at this point. Now, another thing that I think is, really interesting here, that the Jordanians, the Saudis, and the Qataris don't want to participate. These are all countries deeply tied to the U.S. empire. We have major military bases in Qatar. Of course, we have military bases in Jordan. We provide a huge amount of military aid to the Jordanian government. We give Saudi Arabia a huge amount of support. And additionally, the Biden administration has been working on or trying to get a deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize ties. That seems like that is dead as well at this time. So I think there's probably impasse between the U.S. relationship with all these countries when it comes to this story. Now, I think the other point here, and this is the more important one, right, is if the Biden administration either thinks or is pretending, and it's hard at times to tell which one it is, that there is a diplomatic solution to this conflict, then this is going to, I think, keep the status quo policy of giving Israel all the weapons they want continuing to flow and move forward. And so that's where I see as the major story and the major problem here is the White House. Anytime they think there's a deal, that's just going to let them continue in the idea that they think there's going to be a peacekeeping role here at the end of this conflict, means that I think, they're still in the same kind of logic they were back in November a year ago, when it's become very clear that Israel just wants to ethnically cleanse and take the Strip from the Palestinians. And we have more clarity on that here. So Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said Monday that it might be moral and justified for Israel to starve to death 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, but said it couldn't due to international pressure. So Smotrich said at the conference hosted by an Israeli group, "We are bringing aid in because there is no choice. We can't, in the current global reality, manage a war. Nobody will let us cause 2 million civilians to die of hunger, even though it might be justified and moral, until our hostages are returned." So that is, again, a high-ranking Israeli official just making it very clear that there may be no need for a peacekeeping mission at the end of all this, because there's not going to be Palestinians and Israelis both living in Gaza at that point, or I guess, Gazans, Palestinians living in Gaza. All right, next up here, U.S. to let Israel restart military operations in Gaza after first phase of ceasefire deal. I think this is something else that could also really diminish any chances of having a the need for a peacekeeping operation after a deal is agreed to, just because if it's not a permanent ceasefire, I doubt even the Egyptians or the Emiratis will be willing to send their soldiers to potentially get caught in the crossfire between Israel and Hamas if Tel Aviv has a green light to restart its military campaign. So Dave writes here for antiwar.com, the U.S. is ready to guarantee that it would allow Israel to restart the genocidal war in Gaza after the first phase of a hostage and ceasefire deal that might be reached with Hamas, according to Israeli media reports. Hostage deal talks have been stalled since the Israeli killing of Hamas's political chief Ismail Haniyeh, and it's unclear when they will resume, but the U.S. and Israel have been discussing potential proposals. According to the Times of Israel, a proposal that has been discussed would involve the three phases where Israel would halt its military operations and Hamas would return the hostages. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants a guarantee that he will be able to restart military operations after the first phase, which is when negotiations will be held on implementing the next two phases. The U.S. has not yet provided a written agreement that it will allow Israel to restart operations, but has expressed approval of the idea. Ynet reported that the U.S. wouldn't give the guarantee in writing until an agreement was reached with Hamas. The Israeli condition could make Hamas less likely to agree to a deal, since one of its main demands has been a permanent ceasefire and an Israeli withdrawal of Gaza. During previous negotiations, Hamas agreed to language that was vague enough that Israel could accept without actually committing to a permanent ceasefire, but it's unclear if Hamas would agree to a deal where Israel gets an explicit guarantee from the U.S. that it could restart military operations. And if you think about it, you have Egypt and the UAE saying that they would be interested in the peacekeeping mission if they had guarantees from the U.S. That they are involved in this agreement. And so this also could cause some issues from their perspective as well, because again, without the permanent military ceasefire, their troops could be in danger if they're deployed in this peacekeeping mission to Gaza. And so if there isn't an explicit guarantee from the Americans that if there is an explicit guarantee from the Americans that the Israelis could restart, it could just lead them to leaving the negotiations altogether. And when I say they there, I guess I mean the UAE and Egypt. They wouldn't have any reason to negotiate and consider sending their peacekeepers to Gaza. They didn't think there was going to be a full ceasefire at the end of the deal. All right, so next up here, Arab officials say Gaza ceasefire deal won't happen unless U.S. pressures Israel. So a hostage and ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas won't happen unless the U.S. puts pressure on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Times of Israel reported on Wednesday. The report cited unnamed Arab officials from Egypt and Qatar, the countries that have been mediating talks between Israel and Hamas. They say Netanyahu is the main obstacle to an agreement. One of the Arab officials said the U.S. is the only party with enough leverage to get Netanyahu to agree to a deal, since the U.S. is Israel's main weapons supplier. The official said the U.S. could apply pressure by blaming Netanyahu publicly, but U.S. officials have refused to do even as it has become clear that the Israeli leader is the one sabotaging a potential deal. So after Biden unveiled a ceasefire proposal that was on the table at the end of May, the U.S. said Hamas was the only obstacle to an agreement being reached, even as Netanyahu publicly rejected a permanent ceasefire, which was a part of the second phase of the deal Biden announced. Netanyahu's comments made Hamas asked for a commitment to a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal up front. After Hamas conceded and agreed to vague enough language that it wouldn't commit Israel to a permanent ceasefire, Netanyahu added new demands, including indefinite Israeli control of the Gaza-Egypt border and a screening mechanism for Palestinians returning to North Gaza. Israeli officials, including the Mossad director, who is leading the negotiations for Tel Aviv, said Netanyahu's demands would thwart a deal, but U.S. officials refused to name Netanyahu as an obstacle to talks, even after he assassinated Hamas's political chief, Haniyeh, which has put negotiations on hold. White House National Security Advisor John Kirby said Wednesday that it was up to the Hamas's new leader. Well, he was the Hamas leader in Gaza, and now also Haniyeh's replacement as the political chief, that's Sinwar, and that he's the one that needs to agree to a deal, is what Kirby said. This is his quote. And as the chief decision maker, Sinwar needs to decide how to make this deal, to get a ceasefire in place, to get some of those hostages home, and to get us all an opportunity to get more humanitarian assistance in. He needs to accept the deal. When asked if Netanyahu is refusing to sign the deal, Kirby dodged the question, saying, "I'll say it again, there is a proposal on the table. It's a good proposal. It gets us a sweet ceasefire at the most vulnerable hostages out." Earlier this week, Israeli media reported that the U.S. is willing to give Israel a guarantee that it could restart the genocidal war in Gaza after the first phase of the deal is completed. Now, it does look like we will have some talks in the coming days. Hamas officials said the Palestinian group will continue ceasefire negotiations with Israel after Sinwar took over as head of the political bureau following the assassination of Haniyeh. Sinwar is Hamas's leader in Gaza, and the appointment makes him the top political official as well. The negotiations were managed by leadership, and Sinwar was not far from the negotiation process. He was a part of the details, a Hamas official told a Turkish news outlet. Haniyeh was the highest level Hamas official outside of Gaza, which put him in charge of the negotiations with Israel. Although Hamas officials said Sinwar was always involved, the Israeli assassination of Haniyeh was seen as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's latest attempts to sabotage the chance of reaching a deal with Hamas. All right, before we wrap up the show here for the week, we should mention still waiting on the Iranian response to the killing of Haniyeh, and we have this here first. Report: U.S. warns Iran of serious risk if it launches major attack on Israel. So U.S. officials have issued a threat to Iran, warning of serious consequences to the Iranian economy and the country's new government if it launches a major reprisal attack on Israel for the killing of Haniyeh in Tehran. So a U.S. official told the Wall Street Journal, the United States has sent a clear message to Iran that it risks the major escalation if they do a significant retaliatory attack against Israel is extremely high. The U.S. official said the U.S. expressed there is serious risk of consequences for Iran's economy and the stability of its newly elected government if it goes down this path. The warnings were given both directly and through intermediaries, the official said. Back in April, during the last major escalations in the region that was caused by the Israeli bombing of Iran's consulate in Damascus, the U.S. and Iran delivered messages to each other via Omani mediators. The U.S. officials speaking to the Journal insisted that the warning to Iran was not a threat and that the U.S. would carry out strikes in Iran, but warning about a robust military response from Israel. However, the U.S. has pledged to intervene directly to protect Israel, as it did in April, and if the situation turns into a full-blown Iran-Israel war, the U.S. would almost certainly be directly involved. U.S. officials said they don't have a clear picture of when Iran will launch its reprisal attack or how extensive it will be. The U.S. and Israel think it could be coordinated with Hezbollah and other Iranian allies in the region. On Wednesday, U.S. officials told Politico they thought Iran might be thinking of launching a multi-pronged attack on Israel due to rethinking it. So that would mean they're not going to carry out the attack, although I'm not sure how likely that is. I do think Iran is going to do something. I think they feel they have to, because Israel will only step up the assassinations and conduct more if Iran doesn't do anything in response. All right, final article here today. Houthi leader vows Yemen will join axis of resistance in attack on Israel. So on Thursday, the Houthi leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi vowed the Yemeni group will coordinate with the axis of resistance in an attack on Israel in a response to the Israeli escalations in the region. The axis includes Iran, Hezbollah, Shia militias that operate in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthis, who are officially known as Ansar Allah. Iran is vowing revenge for the Israeli killing of Hamas's political chief in Tehran, and Hezbollah is warning it will escalate in response to the Israeli airstrike that killed one of its top commanders in Beirut. So al-Houthi said Ansar Allah would respond to the July 20th Israeli bombing of Yemen's Red Sea port of Hodeidah, which killed 6 people and it caused about $20 million in damage. Israel launched these strikes after a Houthi drone hit Tel Aviv and killed 1 person. So al-Houthi said the inevitable response to the Israeli aggression that targeted the fuel tanks in Hodeidah port is a must and is coming, God willing. Al-Houthi said the delay in the response from the Axis to the Israeli escalations was a tactical decision. The decision to respond is a collective decision across the entire Axis and within each independently. And so I could see this actually kind of making sense to some extent, particularly as all these countries would like Israel to stop what it's doing in Gaza. And so if Israel doesn't know what the response is going to be, what direction it's going to come from, how massive it's going to be, they may feel that they can't commit new military resources to Gaza, or they need to pull some military resources out of Gaza and reposition them in order to deal with the coming threat. And the longer we wait until that threat actually starts to materialize, the longer Israel has to redirect itself from Gaza. So I could see this actually being a strategic move by the Houthis. So the Houthi leader said there was a diplomatic push by the US, Europe, and some Arab countries to contain the response, but that Iran was undeterred, saying the matter touches upon the honor of the Islamic Republic by the killings of its guest in the capital. So al-Houthi also touted recent Houthi attacks on U.S. assets in the region, including the downing of a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone. The U.S. continues to bomb Yemen and intercept Houthi missiles and drones on a near daily basis. The latest U.S. strikes on Yemen targeted the Hodeidah province on Thursday. U.S. Central Command claimed Wednesday that it launched strikes in Yemen and destroyed 2 Houthi drones, a ground control station, and 3 anti-ship cruise missiles. The U.S. bombing campaign has done nothing to stop Houthi attacks on shipping in the region and has only escalated the situation. The U.S. has acknowledged that the Houthis would stop their attacks if there was a ceasefire in Gaza, but the Biden administration has refused to put real pressure on Israel to agree to a ceasefire and continues providing military aid and political support, emboldening Israeli escalations in the region. The U.S. backed Saudi-UAE war against the Houthis from 2015 to 2022 involved heavy airstrikes and a blockade, and the Houthis only became a more capable fighting force during that time. That war killed at least 377,000 people, with more than half dying of starvation and disease caused by the siege. A ceasefire between the Houthis and Saudis has held relatively well since April of 2022, but new U.S. sanctions are now blocking the implementation of a lasting peace deal. All right, everyone. Hope you have a good weekend. Hopefully it's not too busy of a news weekend and we don't have a major war breakout in the Middle East. I do think that we're going to see a reprisal attack, some kind of attack on Israel in the coming days, probably this next week. So definitely keep your eyes out and be sure to subscribe to the show somewhere so you don't miss an episode. Thanks, everyone.